Ethan had always felt at home in the wilderness, the towering pines, the crisp mountain air, the distant calls of wildlife. It was a world untouched by the chaos of civilization. Every weekend, he ventured deep into the forest, following winding trails that few dared to explore. It was his way of finding peace, of disconnecting from the noise of everyday life. That afternoon was no different. With his backpack secured and his boots crunching against the soft earth, he moved steadily along the riverbank, his eyes scanning the horizon. He loved this route. The river, though often unpredictable, added to the beauty of the landscape, carving its way through jagged rocks and fallen logs. But then, something unusual caught his ear, a frantic, desperate splashing. Ethan slowed his pace, his instincts sharpening. Animals often waded into the shallows to drink or cool off, but this sounded different. It was violent. Urgent. He stepped closer to the water, his eyes searching for the source of the commotion. At first, he thought it might be a deer caught in the current, struggling to find its footing. It wasn't uncommon for young ones to misjudge the river's strength and get swept away. But as he focused, his stomach twisted. It wasn't a deer. A bear cub, large for its age but unmistakably young, was flailing in the water, barely managing to keep its head above the raging current. The small creature clawed desperately at the air, its wet fur slick against its body, eyes wide with terror. The river had claimed it, pulling it farther from the shore with each passing second. Ethan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. A bear? Not just any animal, a bear. His first thought was to back away. He had spent enough time in the wild to know that interfering with a wild bear, especially a young one, was dangerous. Where there was a cub, there was a mother. And a mother bear, especially one that thought her child was in danger, was a force of nature no man wanted to face. But then he looked at the cub again. It wasn't just struggling, it was drowning. Every few seconds, its head disappeared beneath the waves, only to resurface in a panicked gasp for air. The longer Ethan stood there, the weaker it became. Soon, it wouldn't have the strength to fight anymore. His fists clenched. This was a death sentence. Ethan had always believed in the balance of nature. The wild was brutal yet fair. But watching the cub slip beneath the water's surface, seeing those tiny paws flailing helplessly, something inside him refused to accept it. It didn't deserve to die like this. His mind raced. The river was fast but not impossible to navigate. If he acted now, he had a chance. But there was no telling what might happen afterward. Even if he managed to save the cub, there was the terrifying possibility that its mother was nearby, watching, waiting to defend her young. Another splash. The cub's head dipped under again, for longer this time. Ethan made his choice. His boots hit the wet rocks as he charged toward the riverbank, already stripping off his heavy backpack. The icy spray bit at his skin as he moved, but he barely noticed. His focus was locked on the fading movements of the cub, its fight nearly gone. This wasn't just about courage or instinct. This was life and death. And Ethan refused to stand by and watch a life slip away. His heart raced as he stepped into the icy waters, the current tugging at his legs with each step. His breath caught in his chest as the coldness of the river numbed his limbs. But there was no time to hesitate. He pushed forward, the rushing water making it hard to maintain his balance. The force of it threatened to drag him under, but he fought against it, every muscle straining to reach the cub. He had done his fair share of dangerous rescues in the past, rushing to save stranded hikers, pulling animals from traps, even helping lost children find their way back to safety. But this felt different. The stakes were higher. The bear wasn't just an animal in need, it was wild, untamed, and unpredictable. The cub's frantic movements grew weaker as it continued to be pulled downstream. The moment Ethan reached it, the bear's eyes locked onto his, wide with terror. For a brief instant, there was a flicker of recognition in those deep brown eyes, as if the cub understood that someone was trying to help. But that brief connection was broken when the bear let out a guttural cry, thrashing wildly in the water. Ethan barely had time to react. With the river rushing around him, he managed to grab hold of the bear's scruff, pulling it closer. His body twisted with the force of the current. He gritted his teeth against the freezing temperature as the bear thrashed in his arms, its claws digging into his skin. But there was no time to wince. He needed to keep going. The river was brutal, its swift flow determined to tear them apart. Every step forward felt like he was being pulled back 2 steps. The cub's weight, though small, was a constant challenge to carry against the current. It was exhausted. But so was Ethan. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, willing himself to move, willing the cub to stay afloat just a little longer. His fingers tightened around its wet fur, every inch of the cub's body pressing against his chest, as if it too understood the peril they were in. Ethan's legs trembled as the river surged around him, pushing him toward the jagged rocks along the shore. It felt as though the water would swallow him whole, but he dug his feet into the riverbed, planting himself firmly. He reached for a low-hanging branch nearby, gripping it with one hand while the other clung to the cub. The cub let out another desperate cry, its paws flailing in the water as it fought against Ethan's grasp. But Ethan refused to let go. His breathing was ragged now, his vision swimming from exhaustion. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, but there was no turning back. His muscles screamed for respite, but the urgency of the situation pushed him onward. A moment of clarity flashed through his mind. This was it. There would be no second chances. He had to get the cub to safety, or they both would be lost. With a final, desperate heave, Ethan dragged the bear cub up the riverbank, using all the strength he could muster. His feet slid on the wet ground, and he stumbled, but he didn't stop. Slowly, inch by inch, they moved farther from the water's reach. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan collapsed onto the riverbank, the cub cradled in his arms. The water continued to roar in the distance, but here, in the relative safety of the shoreline, there was silence. The cub was breathing heavily, its body trembling from both fear and cold. Ethan could feel its shallow, labored breaths against his chest. He gently set it down on the ground, his hands shaking as he checked for any signs of injury. For a moment, the world around them was still. The cub's eyes were closed, its small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Ethan sat beside it, his heart still pounding in his ears, unsure whether the animal would survive. The cold had taken its toll, and he knew that time was running out. He could hear the faint rustling of leaves behind him, but he didn't dare turn around, he was too focused on the bear, his mind racing for what to do next. He had no idea how to help a bear cub that had nearly drowned. There were no first aid kits for this, no instructions. He was alone in the wilderness with a creature that could turn on him at any moment. But all he could do was wait. The cub's shallow breaths grew steadier, and after a few long minutes, it shifted slightly, its eyes blinking open. There was a moment of quiet recognition between them, as if the bear understood that it had been pulled from the brink of death by the very hands of the human it would normally fear. Ethan didn't move, not wanting to startle the cub. Slowly, the bear sat up, its trembling form still weak but alive. Ethan let out a quiet breath, his shoulders sagging with relief. But as the cub gazed up at him, something unspoken passed between them. This was only the beginning. The journey ahead would be just as dangerous for both of them. Ethan sat motionless, his breath shallow, as he watched the bear cub struggle to sit upright. The animal was visibly exhausted, its fur soaked and matted against its small frame. Its entire body trembled, a mix of fear, cold, and the sheer trauma of what had just happened. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan could feel the wild energy in the air, the kind that existed between predator and prey. But this was different. The cub wasn't acting on instinct to flee or attack, it simply sat there, blinking at him, trying to process its survival. Ethan knew he should leave. The cub's mother could be nearby, and if she was, she would not take kindly to finding a human near her baby. But something held him there. The cub was too weak to move, and if he left it now, it wouldn't stand a chance against the dangers of the forest. He let out a slow breath, thinking. He had saved its life, but now what? He wasn't a wildlife expert, and there were no nearby sanctuaries where he could take it. The best he could do was make sure it recovered enough strength to return to the wild. Carefully, he unzipped his backpack and pulled out a dry flannel shirt. It wasn't much, but it was something. He draped it over the bear's small body, hoping to offer a little warmth. The cub flinched slightly at the movement but didn't resist. The wind howled through the trees, sending a chill through Ethan's soaked clothes. He had to get dry. More importantly, he had to get a fire going, both for himself and the cub. If either of them stayed this cold for too long, the consequences could be deadly. He moved cautiously, keeping one eye on the cub as he gathered dry leaves and twigs from the nearby brush. His fingers trembled as he struck a match, the small flame flickering weakly before catching. Slowly, warmth spread from the small fire, casting an orange glow on the cub's damp fur. Minutes passed in silence. The cub, still curled beneath Ethan's flannel, didn't move. Its breathing was slow but steady. The warmth seemed to be helping, but Ethan wasn't sure if it would be enough. He sighed, leaning back against a tree. His body ached from the struggle against the river, his muscles stiffening with exhaustion. He had been in plenty of tough situations before, but this was something else entirely. Then something unexpected happened. The cub shifted slightly, its nose twitching as it inhaled the warm air. It turned its head, eyes meeting Ethan's again. But this time, there was something different, a flicker of trust, of understanding. It wasn't just looking at him, it was watching him. Ethan wasn't sure what to make of it. Wild animals didn't form bonds with humans, at least, not like this. "You're lucky, you know that," he muttered, more to himself than to the cub. His voice was hoarse from the cold. The bear blinked but didn't react. It simply stared, its small body still trembling slightly. Ethan knew he had a choice. He could leave now, let nature take its course and pretend this never happened. Or he could stay, at least until the cub had enough strength to return to the wild. Deep down, he already knew what he was going to do. Sitting by the fire, watching the young bear drift into uneasy sleep, Ethan had no idea that his act of kindness would set in motion something far greater than he could ever imagine. Because somewhere out there, in the darkness of the forest, something was watching, something much larger, something that would change everything. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire, watching the cub's slow, steady breaths. The flames crackled softly, casting shifting shadows across the forest floor. The bear had curled into a tight ball beneath the flannel shirt, its small body finally still after the chaos of the river. Ethan shifted his gaze to the trees beyond, his instincts keeping him alert. Something about the night felt different. The forest was never silent, but tonight it held an eerie stillness. He had spent years in the wilderness and knew when something was off. The cub stirred slightly, its ears twitching, but it didn't wake. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his damp face. He was exhausted, but rest wasn't an option. He wasn't just a man in the woods anymore, he was a man who had interfered with nature in the most dangerous way possible. And he had no idea if he had made the right choice. Morning came slowly, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cold morning air sent a chill through Ethan's body. He stretched, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles. Every inch of him ached from the rescue, but he was alive. And so was the cub. The young bear lifted its head, groggy, blinking against the light. Its fur was dry now, but it still looked weak. Ethan expected it to bolt the moment it had the strength to return to whatever life it had before the river tried to take it. But it didn't run. Instead, it watched him, studying his every movement. There was no fear in its gaze now, only quiet curiosity. Ethan sighed, rubbing his forehead. "You should go, you know," he muttered, glancing toward the trees. "You don't belong here with me." The cub didn't move. Ethan stood, stretching his sore limbs. He needed to pack up, get back to the trail. He had done what he could. The bear was alive. That was enough. But as he slung his backpack over his shoulder and took a step away, he heard soft shuffling behind him. He turned. The cub was following. Ethan frowned. "No," he said firmly, shaking his head. "That's not how this works." The cub hesitated, ears twitching, but it didn't retreat. Ethan took another step. The cub followed. A slow, uneasy realization settled over him. This wasn't normal. Wild animals didn't just stick around after an encounter like this. Fear and instinct usually sent them running, but not this one. Ethan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You're making this difficult," he muttered. He took a deep breath and turned fully toward the bear, raising his hands in an attempt to look bigger. "Go," he said, his voice firm. He stomped his foot lightly on the ground. "Get out of here." The cub flinched slightly but didn't budge. Ethan stared at it, a mix of frustration and disbelief twisting in his chest. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had saved the cub's life, but that was it, his job was done. So why wouldn't it leave? He sighed, shaking his head. Maybe it was still weak. Maybe it just needed a little more time before instinct kicked in and sent it running into the forest where it belonged. "Fine," he muttered, adjusting his pack. "But don't get any ideas." He turned and started walking toward the trail, determined to put some distance between himself and the cub. But sure enough, as his boots crunched against the forest floor, he heard the soft padding of paws behind him. It was still following. Ethan exhaled sharply, glancing over his shoulder. The cub trailed a few feet behind, its eyes locked onto him as if he were its only lifeline. Something about that look unsettled him. He wasn't sure if it was gratitude, fear, or something else entirely, but he had a sinking feeling that this wasn't over. Far from it. Ethan walked faster, hoping the cub would eventually stop following. He didn't want to look back, didn't want to see those dark, trusting eyes staring up at him. But after 10 minutes, he finally gave in and turned around. The cub was still there. It kept its distance, trailing behind cautiously, but it didn't leave. It moved when he moved, stopped when he stopped, a quiet shadow clinging to him as if he was its only hope of survival. Ethan groaned, rubbing a hand down his face. "You're really not getting this, are you?" he muttered. The cub tilted its head slightly, as if trying to understand. Ethan shook his head and faced forward again. He couldn't take it with him, that wasn't how nature worked. It needed to go back to the wild to find its mother. If she was even alive. That thought settled uneasily in his gut. He had no idea if the cub had been separated from its mother before the river incident, or if the mother had drowned trying to save it. The possibility made his chest feel heavier. Either way, he couldn't keep it. He pressed on, hiking toward his cabin, hoping the cub would eventually lose interest. Hours passed, and when he finally emerged from the trees, the sight of his small wooden cabin filled him with relief. The familiar creak of the porch, the scent of pine lingering in the air, it was home. He sighed, setting his pack down. But when he turned around, his stomach twisted. The cub had followed him all the way back. It sat at the edge of the clearing, its small body barely visible against the backdrop of trees. It didn't move closer. It just watched. Ethan felt something strange settle over him, a mix of exasperation, concern, and something he couldn't quite name. This was unnatural. The bear should have left by now. He let out a deep breath and turned away, stepping inside his cabin. The door creaked shut behind him, blocking out the sight of the persistent cub. It would leave. It had to. That was what wild animals did. But later that night, as Ethan sat outside by the fire, something shifted in the woods. At first, he thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees. But then he heard it. Heavy footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. His body tensed. He wasn't alone. His eyes darted toward the tree line, scanning the darkness. The cub was still sitting there, unmoving. But something was different now. It wasn't watching Ethan anymore. It was staring into the trees. Ethan's breath hitched as a massive shadow emerged from the darkness. Towering. Powerful. Unmistakable. A fully grown bear. The cub made a soft rumbling noise, barely audible, but Ethan heard it. A sound of recognition. His pulse pounded in his ears. He stayed completely still, his instincts screaming at him not to move. The mother bear was here. And it had come straight to him. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The massive bear stood at the edge of the clearing, its hulking frame blending into the darkness. The firelight flickered against its thick fur, casting shifting shadows across the ground. It didn't charge. Didn't growl. Just stood there. Watching. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run, but he knew better. Running would only trigger the bear's predatory instinct. He stayed frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. The cub, still sitting a few feet away, let out another small noise, a whimper? A greeting? Ethan couldn't tell. But whatever it was, the massive bear reacted. It took a step forward. Ethan's fingers twitched toward the knife at his belt, but he knew it would be useless against something this size. If the bear wanted him dead, he wouldn't stand a chance. Another step. The mother bear's eyes flicked from the cub to Ethan, her expression unreadable. There was no rage. No immediate aggression. But there was something else. A quiet intensity. She knew. Somehow, in the way only animals understood, she knew. Ethan didn't move, his mind racing, trying to make sense of the situation. The cub had followed him all day. Had it been leading her here? Had she been searching for her young all this time? The air was thick with tension. Then, to Ethan's absolute shock, the mother bear did something unexpected. She lowered her head. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a charge. It was something else entirely. A sign of acknowledgement. Ethan's breath came out shakily. He had seen bears in the wild many times before. They were territorial. Unpredictable. Rarely gave second chances. But this one seemed different. The cub finally stood, its legs still wobbly, and took a few cautious steps toward its mother. The mother sniffed it over, nudging it gently with her massive snout, checking for injuries. Ethan remained motionless. This was it. The moment the cub would leave. The moment nature would correct itself. He had done what he could. Now, it was time for them to go. But the mother bear wasn't finished. She turned her gaze back to Ethan, watching him in a way that made his skin prickle. Then, without warning, she took a step back and let out a low, guttural sound. A call. Ethan flinched as he saw movement in the darkness behind her. His eyes widened in disbelief. Lying in the grass behind the mother bear was something he never expected to see. A fresh kill. A deer, recently taken down, its body still warm. Ethan's mind struggled to process what was happening. This wasn't normal. Bears didn't behave this way. The realization struck him like a lightning bolt. This wasn't just an act of survival. This was an offering. A gift. The mother bear had brought him food. A shiver ran down his spine, not from fear, but from something far greater. This was the wild. Untouched by human hands. And yet, it was showing him something that defied all logic. Gratitude. Ethan didn't know what to do. He had no idea how to respond to something so primal, so unexplainable. Slowly, carefully, he lowered his hands to his sides, showing he wasn't a threat. The mother bear watched him for a long moment before nudging the cub forward. The young bear hesitated, looking back at Ethan one last time. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, it followed its mother into the trees. Ethan stood there long after they disappeared into the darkness, his pulse still pounding. He had saved the cub's life, and in return, the wild had acknowledged him in a way he never thought possible. A miracle had happened that night, and Ethan knew, deep in his soul, that he would never be the same again. Ethan stood motionless, staring into the empty darkness where the bears had disappeared. The forest had returned to its usual rhythm, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft crackling of embers from his dying fire, but everything felt different now. The mother bear had left him a gift. A wild animal, a creature ruled by instinct, had somehow recognized what he had done and responded in the only way it knew how. It wasn't just survival. It wasn't just nature playing out in its usual, brutal way. It was something more. Ethan let out a slow breath, finally breaking free from his stunned daze. His body was still stiff from exhaustion, his muscles aching from the struggle in the river, but his mind raced, replaying every second of the past 24 hours. He had nearly died saving that cub. He had risked everything on an impulse, on a feeling that he couldn't just stand by and watch a life slip away. And now, the wild had acknowledged him in return. Ethan wasn't sure how long he stood there before finally turning back toward his cabin. The gift, the fresh deer carcass, remained untouched, lying just at the tree line where the mother bear had left it. He didn't take it. He couldn't. It wasn't his to claim. Instead, he left it there, allowing the forest to take back what belonged to it. The next morning, the deer was gone. Ethan wasn't sure if the mother bear had returned for it or if other scavengers had taken advantage of the offering, but it didn't matter. What mattered was what had happened, what he had witnessed. Days passed, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Not in a way that sent fear crawling up his spine, but in a way that felt oddly familiar. Every so often, as he walked through the woods near his cabin, he would catch glimpses of something large moving between the trees, a shadow, a presence. He never felt threatened. He never felt afraid. It was as if the bears were checking in, making sure he was still there, just as he had done for the cub when it was on the brink of death. Then, one evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he saw them again, the mother bear and her cub. They stood at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the fading light. The cub had grown in just a short time, its fur thicker, its body stronger. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, as if to acknowledge their strange connection one final time, the mother bear lowered her head ever so slightly before turning away. The cub followed, casting one last glance toward Ethan before disappearing into the forest. That was the last time he ever saw them. Ethan never spoke about what happened that night to anyone else. It would have sounded like nothing more than a wild tale, something exaggerated over time. But he knew the truth. He had witnessed something rare, something few ever got to experience. The untamed world had shown him a kind of gratitude, a connection that went beyond language or reason. It had changed him in ways he couldn't explain. From that day forward, Ethan saw the wilderness differently. It wasn't just a place to explore, it was alive. And sometimes, if a person was lucky enough, it whispered back. Stories like these remind us of the deep and mysterious connections we share with nature, moments that challenge our understanding of the wild. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more incredible tales, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. And if you believe in the power of kindness, share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.